Hello and welcome to IMS International Strategy Series. If you are aiming for a top GMAT score, you are in the right place. This series is designed to give you a step-by-step strategy, insider tips and everything you need to succeed on the GMAT. From breaking down complex questions to mastering time management, we'll tackle it all. So, whether you are just starting out or looking to fine-tune your skills, stick around and let's dive into your path to GMAT success. So in this very first strategy video, we are going to be tackling your favorite section, that is the quantitative reasoning section. Now, in quantitative reasoning section, there is only one type of question asked, that is problem solving. But your quant skills are going to be utilized in solving one more brand of question, that is a data sufficiency question, which you would find where in the data insights section, which is basically your third section in the GMAT examination, right? So your quant skills are not only going to help you tackle questions of the quantitative reasoning section, but also questions from the data insights section, right? So therefore, it's very important that you start working on your quantitative reasoning. Now, before we try to understand that how do we tackle these questions from quant, there are few things that you need to keep in mind. Point number one, you have 45 minutes to solve these 21 questions that will come in the quantitative reasoning section, and the overall score that you would be getting would be somewhere between 60 and 90, where 90 is the highest that anybody could get. If I try to do basic math over here, what do I understand? That I have 45 minutes and I have 21 questions. So I have just above 2 minutes to solve every question. Now, this is a math that most of the students do, and this is the math that is somewhat wrong. Why is it wrong? Because students believe that every question needs to be solved in just above 2 minutes. That is not the case. There will be questions coming at you that will require a lot of analysis. You will have to understand what's the catch in the question and might require 4 or maybe 4.5 minutes for you to solve. But for a student who is well prepared, there are going to be questions that you can solve in 60 to 90 seconds. So the point is that I do not need to solve every question in just above 2 minutes. I need to maintain an average of just above 2 minutes to complete this very first section in time, right? Point number two, there is not going to be any calculator available in the quantitative reasoning section, although a calculator is provided in the data insights section. Now, what does that mean? This basically means that my calculation techniques, my mental math has to be on point so that I am able to do probably those tedious calculations in quick time, and I am able to save those precious seconds, which might make a difference of 1 or 2 questions, right? Third point, and that's a breather for most of the students, that GMAT has stopped asking questions from the geometry section. Right, they are now only testing you on what? Arithmetic and algebra and all the subtopics that come in these 2 major sections. And the last point, which is probably the most important one, the penalty that you would be getting on getting an easier question wrong would be higher than the reward you might get on getting a difficult question right. Sounds confusing? Let me give you an example. So let's say there are these 2 candidates, candidate 1 and candidate 2, and both of them have attempted, let's say, 5 questions. Now let's assume that the first question is the easiest one and the 5th question is probably the most difficult one out of these 5. Now, if candidate 1 gets these 4 questions right and the most difficult one wrong, on the other hand, candidate 2 gets the very first question wrong, but the remaining 4 questions correct. Now, we might feel that candidate 2 is a better candidate than candidate 1 because he solved the most difficult question. But that is not how GMAT is going to perceive this. GMAT is going to assume that candidate 2 made an error in probably the most easiest question of the lot, and therefore candidate 2 is going to get lesser points as compared to candidate 1 in the quant section, assuming that there are only these 5 questions on which the score is calculated, right? So that's a big catch. And what does that tell you? We are not allowed to make silly errors in those simple questions because the penalty is going to be much higher. Alright, so on that note, let's begin with the very first section, That is, how do we go ahead and tackle problem solving questions, right? Now, there are multiple ways of solving questions. What we are going to be doing is, I would be probably giving you 3 to 4 questions right now and sufficient time for you to solve. And after that, I would be explaining that what are the different ways of solving questions. So, brace yourself, and here's the very first question. X, Y, and Z each try independently to solve a problem. If the individual probabilities are 1 by 4, 1 by 2, and 5 by 8 respectively, what is the probability that X and Y, but not Z, will be able to solve the problem? And here are the 5 options. Pause the video, give it a shot, and then resume to look at the solution. Alright, so it's a very basic question on probability, and if you are not thorough with your concepts on probability, don't worry. Firstly, get acquainted with all the nitty-gritties of probability, and then if you try to solve this question, this is going to be a very easy one, right? The point I'm trying to make in this question is that how do we solve this question? There are these 3 people and some data has been given to us. The point is, I need to find out that X is able to solve this particular question, Y is able to solve this particular question, but Z is not able to solve this question. What's the probability of that happening, right? So there are these 3 events that need to happen simultaneously. Now, if you are thorough with your probability concept, it's actually a very simple one. Now, one thing is pretty sure, that option A cannot be the answer. Why is that? Because the probabilities can never be more than 1, right? So therefore, option A can be easily eliminated. The sad part is none of the other options can be eliminated using the same logic. Okay, if if X is able to solve a question and the probability is 1 by 4, can I say that X not able to solve that problem would be 3 by 4? Because hey, you can either solve a problem or you cannot solve a problem. There is no in between, right? So therefore, if my probability of solving a question is, let's say, 1 by 4, that out of 4 times I am able to solve the problem only 1 time, the rest of the 3 times I won't be able to solve the problem, and therefore my probability of not able to solve that problem would be 3 by 4. Okay, so the probability that X is able to solve the problem would be 1 by 4. The probability that Y would be able to solve the problem would be 1 by 2 by using the same logic, and the probability that Z won't be able to solve the problem would be 3 by 8, because Z able to solve the problem, the probability is 5 by 8. So therefore, Z not able to solve the problem, the probability would be 3 by 8. Now, many students get confused whether I need to add these 3 probabilities or I need to multiply this. So there's a very simple catch to this, that I want X to solve the problem and Y to solve the problem and Z not to solve the problem. So whenever in the calculations of probability or permutation combination, whenever we have the word and, we would always be multiplying them, right? So therefore, X able to solve the problem, Y able to solve the problem, and Z not able to solve the problem would be the multiplication of these 3. So that turns out to be how much? 3 over 64, and option E would be your correct answer. So the point is, if I look at this question, I had no option but to solve this entire thing with the data that was given to me and then look at the 5 options. So that's one way of solving this question. Now, many people do make this error of adding these 3 probabilities and getting an answer that would be a part of the options, right? So I hope you do not make such conceptual errors, because that is one very common error that people tend to make and you should avoid, right? Now, moving on to another question. Now, this question is a part of your statistics, that if Q is an odd number and the median of Q consecutive integers is 120, what is the largest of these integers? And there are these 5 options in front of you. Try this and then we will try to understand how do we go ahead and solve this question. Alright, so now let's try and understand how do we tackle this question. Q is an odd number. I hope everybody understands what an odd number is. Maybe 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, etc. Right? And the median of Q consecutive integers is 120. What is the largest of these integers? Now, why are we solving this question? If we look at the previous one, we had, as I mentioned, no other option but to solve the question and then look at the options. But can I do the same thing over here as well? We can, but it might take us a lot of time. And therefore, now I am introducing you to another way of solving a quant question. See, if Q is an odd number, let's take any odd number. I mean, if it is going to be true for 3, it has to be true for 5 as well. It has to be true for 7 as well, right? So, what I would assume is that let's say the value of Q is 3. So, now let's read the question again. If 3 is an odd number and the median of 3 consecutive integers is 120. Okay, so there's one very important term over here, that is consecutive. So what do we mean by consecutive? Numbers that come one after the other, right? So now I have got 3 consecutive integers and the median of those 3 consecutive integers. So there's this number, there's this number, there's this number. So the median of these 3 consecutive integers is going to be what? 120. What does that mean? If these 3 are consecutive, this has to be 119, because for us to calculate median, we have to arrange the data in ascending order or maybe descending order, and the third term has to be 121. So let's read the question again. So if 3 is an odd number and the median of 3 consecutive integers is 120, what is the largest of these 3 integers? Okay, so the largest of these 3 integers is 121. Now if I look at these 5 options, nowhere is it mentioned 121. Why is that? Because we assumed the value of Q to be 3. And obviously 121 is not going to be a part of these options, right? What would be a part of these options? All the options are consisting of Q as their part, right? So now my task would be to find out that option in which when I put Q equal to 3, I get the answer as 121, because that is what my question was, that what is the largest of these integers. So in whichever option after putting Q as 3, I get 121 as the answer. That has to be the option. That has to be the correct option, right? So let's start with option 1. If I put 3 over here, 3 minus 1 is 2, 2 upon 2 is 1, 1 plus 120 is 121. Option A could be my answer. Now, this is something that you need to take care of, that just because option A did give you 121, that doesn't mean the rest of the options can't give you 121, right? So therefore, we have to be very, very sure before we eliminate all the 4 options and then mark option A. Why is that? Because there can be questions where people would be using this technique and in multiple options they get 121 as the answer, right? So therefore we have to eliminate the remaining 4 options and not straight away mark option A as the correct answer, right? Now if I put 3 over here, don't waste your time in actually calculating. An odd number divided by 2 is obviously something that is going to end in 0.5. So option B is not even going to give me an integer. I don't care what the answer is, it's not even going to give me an integer. Similarly, if I talk about option C, Q upon 2 plus 120, again the same problem. 3 upon 2 is going to be 1.5 and 1.5 plus 120 is obviously not going to be 121. Option C can be eliminated. Option D, now 3 plus 119, ideally you should not be doing this, and this is the mental calculation, this is the mental math I was talking about, that this is something that should be happening in your head, right? So 3 plus 119 would be 122 and 122 upon 2 would be 61, and not the answer I was looking for. I was looking for what? I was looking for 121, right? So therefore even option D cannot be my answer. And if I look at option E, Q plus 120, 3 plus 120 is 123, and 123 upon 2 is also going to end in decimals, right? So therefore, all the remaining 4 options were wrong. Option A would have been the correct answer. Now, this is an actual question that has been retired from the GMAT and students were able to solve this, right? But a lot of students made an error of using the technique from the previous question, where from the data, they were trying to get to the answer and not the other way around. What we did was, from the data, we assumed the value of Q, we got an answer that was easier for us to comprehend, and then we moved on to check which option would match the values that we had taken, right? So that is second way of solving a quant question, where you take an arbitrary value, you get the answer, and then you check out of these 5 options which option is satisfying this, right? So in this question, I wanted to find out what is the largest of these 3 integers, and therefore what I did was I found out which is the largest of these 3 integers, and then I checked which option is satisfying, right? So that's the second way of solving a question in the quant section, right? Now we are moving on to the third and the last question of problem solving. After this, we would be taking up a question on data sufficiency, right? Pause the video, give it a shot, and then I'll explain how I would solve this particular question. All right, this is another question that has been retired from the GMAT examination, and it's actually a very simple one if we do it tactfully. And this was that question which I was talking about in the very beginning, questions that take probably 60 to 90 seconds to solve, right? Now there might be people who go ahead and take an LCM, probably make a quadratic equation and then try to solve the question, right? Not the approach that a smart candidate would apply, right? Again, this is not that first question that we did where I had to solve and then look at the options. No, this is a question in which I would be using these options to get to the answer, right? And this is not similar to the previous question in which I had to assume some data and then check out of these 5 options which would be the correct one, right? So therefore, what are we supposed to do in this? We are just going to pick up these values, substitute over here and check which would give me the correct answer, right? Now, if you are smart, you would not be checking all the options. Why do I say this? Look at the options. Option A is 0. Now, assuming that was the correct answer, what does that mean? 0 would be satisfying this equation. Now, can 0 satisfy this equation? The answer is no, because my very first term is 1 upon x and 1 upon 0 is going to be an undefined number. So therefore, 0 cannot be the answer, right? And therefore, I can eliminate option A. Now, if you are with me and if you are smart enough, you would be able to understand that for the same logic, even option B and option E cannot be our answer. Why is that? Because -1 would make this part as 0 and -4 would make this part as 0. So therefore, option A, B and E were easily eliminated. We didn't even have to substitute and check whether that is satisfying the equation or not. Now, there are only 2 options remaining. Let's start with any one of them. I'll start with -2. So, 1 upon -2 minus -2 plus 1 should be equal to 1 upon -2 plus 4. I've done nothing but just plugged in the values of x, right? Now, what would be this? This is -1 by 2. Now, -2 plus 1 is -1. And there's already a negative sign outside, so therefore this would become plus 1. Should be equal to 1 upon -2 plus 4 is what? -2 plus 4 is 2. Now, this is what? 1 minus 1 by 2, which is nothing but 1 by 2. So, I am getting that 1 by 2 is equal to 1 by 2. And that is what we wanted, right? And therefore, option C would be marked as the correct answer. Don't waste your time in checking option D, because GMAT has only one correct answer, right? So don't waste your time in actually checking whether option D is satisfying the given equation or not. It is definitely not going to satisfy, right? So these are generally the 3 ways of solving any question that you would encounter in the problem solving section. Now, few points that you should be understanding. If you look at my approach and if you look at anybody who is appearing for the examination and scoring good, their approach is very, very simple. They are not trying to complicate things. The very first step that you need to do is you need to read the question properly. What we do is, in order to solve the question quickly, we miss on to key terms. I am pretty sure that a lot of people miss on to points that x and y are integers. They believe that x and y are real numbers. Many people forget to read that x, y and z are consecutive integers, and they try to make an equation that doesn't yield the answer. right? So the first and the foremost thing that you need to do is read the question carefully, read the data carefully, because GMAT will be providing you with a lot of data, and therefore it is of utmost importance that we understand the nuances and we understand what are the catches present in the question, right? In the very first question that we did today, right, a lot of students would have missed onto the word consecutive, or maybe would have missed onto the word odd numbers, right? Why does that happen? Because we try to solve it very, very quickly. We believe that we would be able to solve it in 2 minutes, right? But if you miss onto these key words, obviously you are going to get the question wrong, right? So therefore, my very first suggestion to you would be that read the question properly. Even if it takes 10 seconds extra, I'm absolutely okay with it, because it is going to reduce the solving time, right? The second thing is obviously understand the question, right? I know it sounds very, very boring, but you need to understand the question, you need to understand the data, and after that you need to understand what is the question asked to you, right? The third part is obviously the solving part, and we are not supposed to make errors over here. If possible, check each and every step that you are doing while you are doing it, right? Because a lot of times people make this error that 5 into 8 is 45. Right? So we do not want to make such kind of silly errors, because there is time pressure, nobody can deny that, right? And therefore in this particular time pressure, we tend to make such kind of errors, right? So make sure that while solving, you are checking each and every step that you are doing and not doing it towards the end, right? Last one is you should reread the question. Now that's a very, very safe practice to do. Why is that? Because many a times we solve the entire question and get the value of x. But in the question, we were supposed to calculate the value of 2x. Now, believe me, if I get the value of x as, let's say, 2 is going to be one of the options. But what was the question? The question was to calculate the value of 2x. This is just a random example that we are taking, but it happens a lot that you make an equation, you get to the variable, but the question that was asked to you was different. So you are not going to get marks for those steps, for all the correct things that you had done so far, right? You are only going to get deduction for marking the wrong answer. So please make sure that after you have solved the entire equation and found out the value of variable, you reread the question and try and understand what was the question asked to you. So if you follow these basic steps, you would be on track to get a decent enough score in the quantitative reasoning section. Now we are moving on to the last part of today's video, where we would be understanding how do we tackle data sufficiency questions, right? Now, in data sufficiency question, there will be some data given to you. Below that, there will be two statements. So let's take an example, right? So there is this data given to you, and there are these two statements. Your job is to find out which statement would be sufficient to answer the question. So the 5 options that would be present to you would be: option A states that statement 1 alone would give you the answer, but statement 2 alone would not. Option B states statement 1 alone won't give the answer, but statement 2 alone would give the answer. Option C states that 1 and 2 together are necessary to answer the question. Option D states each statement alone is sufficient to answer the question. And option E states even after combining both the statements, we won't be able to get to the answer, right? So these are the 5 options. Pause the video, try it out, and then let me know what would be the solution. All right, so let's look at this question. T, J, and S each purchased a new house. The average price of the 3 houses was 120,000. What is the median price of the 3 houses? Now, how do we start with a data sufficiency question, right? The first thing that you should be doing is understand the data that has been given in the common part. So these first 3 lines are your common data. Irrespective of what is given in these 2 statements, this part is always going to be true, right? So your first step should be to understand what is given over here. So I can see that there are these 3 people, T, J, and S, and each of them have purchased a new house, and the average price was 120,000. So something on these lines, that T plus J plus S over 3 was equal to 120k. Maybe this might be helpful for us to solve. what is the median price of the three houses. Okay, so for that to happen, I need to know what is the value of T, I need to know what is the value of J, I need to know what is the value of S. And after that, I need to arrange them in ascending order, and the middlemost value is going to be my median. I mean, that is how we have been calculating median so far, right? So let's see. Many people might fall into that trap. Many people might have that temptation of looking at both these statements before completing this common data. Refrain from that. Your first step should always be to understand the data and to understand the question. My question is what? What is the median price of the three houses? What was my data? What was my common data? That the average price was 120K. Alright, so now let's look at both the statements and we would be looking at them individually. Again, many people make this error of combining both the statements if the first statement was not sufficient, right? So we would be looking at both these statements individually. So the first statement is the price of Tom's house was 110K. Now, if I put that 110K over here, the best thing that I can do is calculate the value of J plus S. That's the best we can do. But I do not know what is J, I do not know what is S, and hence I won't be able to calculate what is the median. So we can safely say that statement 1 doesn't seem to be sufficient to answer this question, right? Now, this is where most of the people make an error. Right after this, they combine both the statements and then they might be able to get the answer, because it is pretty straightforward that if I combine both the statements, I have the value of T, I have the value of J, and therefore I would be able to get the value of S. And once I get all these three values, calculating median is going to be very easy. But you are not supposed to do that ever. You are supposed to look at the second statement individually, because what if statement 2 alone was sufficient to answer the question and the data given in statement 1 was a redundant one, right? So therefore, you are supposed to beat that temptation of combining both the statements together right after you are not able to solve it using statement 1 alone. That's the biggest mistake, that's the biggest challenge that students face in the data sufficiency section. Alright, now let's look at the second statement, although this is not looking very promising. The price of Jane's house was 120K. Now I have been given that the value of J is what? 120K. And this might not look promising, but this is actually a very, very good statement and a beautifully framed question. Now understand. If the value of J is 120K, why am I focusing on this? Because this 120K is actually equal to the average that was given to us. So now, if the value of J is 120K, there are two cases that would make my overall average to be 120. Understand? If the value of J is 120 and the remaining two numbers are also 120, in that case and only in that case would my overall average be 120, right? Because if the third quantity is 120 and the first quantity is 120, all the three quantities were equal, that is when my average would have been equal to 120. And if all the three terms are same, my median would be 120, right? So therefore, if all the three terms were same, my median was 120. But who told that all these three terms are same? There's a possibility that all the three are different. But if all the three are different, what does that mean? If one quantity is 120, the remaining two quantities are not supposed to be 120 because they're supposed to be different, right? So one of the quantities has to be more than 120 and the third quantity has to be less than 120, because if both the quantities are more than 120, my average would be more than 120, which is not the case because our common data states that the average has to be 120. Similarly, if all the two remaining quantities are less than 120, my average would be shifting towards the left side and my average would be less than 120. But I want the average to be 120. And therefore, one thing is pretty clear that if the three terms are different, one of them would be more than 120 and the other one would be less than 120. Now, to be honest, I don't care what those values are, because whatever those values are, After I arrange them in ascending order, 120 is always going to come in the middle, and therefore that's going to be my median. So therefore, if I look at just the second statement, I am able to get to the answer, and there was no requirement of statement 1. So this is the most common trap that people fall into, and that's why I felt it necessary for you to understand this as one of your strategies, right? So your entire data sufficiency section, one tip that I would like to give, apart from whatever I have explained to you so far, that even before your section starts, even before your GMAT paper starts, it's a very good practice to write down options. So what I did in my paper was, I wrote down these 5 options: A, B, C, D, E, A, B, C, D, E, A, B, C, D, E. I wrote it multiple times. Now that helped me in the verbal section. That also helped me in the data sufficiency section. How does that help me? So when I looked at this particular question and when I tried statement 1, I was not able to get to the answer, and therefore it was very easy for me to eliminate option A and option D. I hope you are able to understand this legend, right? So my answer has to be either B or C or E. Now I just have to look at statement 2 individually. If I get to the answer, I go ahead and mark option B. If not, and only then I would be merging both the statements and trying to get to the answer, right? So that is how you should be tackling the data sufficiency question, because the most difficult option in this would be option B, because many people tend to miss that if statement 1 alone is not sufficient, we have to combine both. That is not the case. Do look at second statement individually, and if then you are not able to get to the answer, then and only then combine both the statements. So on that note, we are coming to the end of the very first strategy video. I hope you liked this. If you liked our content, please make sure to like the video and hit the subscribe button. Thank you.